What if the most dangerous royal secrets weren't hidden in vaults, but printed in polite denial, sealed with a smile, and buried in plain sight? For centuries, the British monarchy has waved from balconies while shoving scandals under carpets lined with gold. But some rumors refuse to stay rumors. From secret marriages and Nazi sympathies to offshore millions and ghost-written monarchs, these 53 once dismissed claims were all eventually proven true. This isn't history. It's damage control on a crown-shaped timeline. Welcome to the stories they swore weren't real, until they were. Before we dive headfirst into the royal rabbit hole, make sure you're subscribed, because untangling centuries of polished lies takes time, and you're going to want to stick around. And while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country and what time it is in the comments. Midnight conspiracies? Lunchtime scandals? We're all in this mess together. 1. Queen Caroline of Brunswick was spied on by the government. She wasn't a queen. They made sure of that. At least, not the kind you put on postage stamps. Caroline of Brunswick was George IV's estranged wife, or as the court liked to whisper, the national embarrassment with a loud voice and a sharper tongue. Her crime? Not dying quietly after her husband left her. And so, she became a problem. The kind that needed to be monitored, tracked, watched, preferably discredited. The rumor that she was being spied on began in whispers from court insiders and gutter press editors. People claimed the government had her followed by low-level agents, bribing innkeepers, maids, and stable boys to collect stories about her supposed immorality. But in the age before phones and wiretaps, surveillance came with a side of shame. The government denied it all. Ministers smirked. The palace rolled its eyes. Decades later, those same smirking ministers were exposed. Parliamentary archives and dusty account books revealed tidy payments for informational services tied to Caroline's travels. Operatives had indeed been embedded in her household. They noted who she dined with, who she laughed with, who she may have slept with. The evidence was not collected for justice, but for leverage. Caroline, for her part, was fully aware she was being watched. She responded with carefully staged performances, laughing too loud in public, parading her improper friendships before a scandal-hungry press. In the war of optics, she made herself look defiant while the men behind closed doors scrambled to suppress her every move. When she died, barely allowed to attend her own coronation, the monarchy breathed a sigh of relief. But the scandal stuck. A queen accused of promiscuity, denied dignity, and hounded by her own government. The real crime wasn't her behavior. It was how far the crown would go to erase a woman who refused to be quiet. And if you thought royal surveillance ended there, wait until you meet the king who secretly married a Catholic and tried to burn the evidence. 2. George IV secretly married a Catholic woman, Maria Fitzherbert. Let's be clear, this wasn't a love story. This was a royal cover-up stitched together with powdered wigs, forged denials, and a marriage certificate locked in a cabinet for decades. George IV, then the Prince of Wales, was, in many ways, a blueprint for the modern tabloid royal. Petulant, extravagant, perpetually in debt. And in 1785, he did the one thing absolutely forbidden by law and by crown. He secretly married a Catholic woman. Maria Fitzherbert was a twice-widowed commoner, Catholic, and, worst of all, uninterested in playing court puppet. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772 made it illegal for royals to wed without the king's permission. Marrying a Catholic was political suicide. George didn't care. He went ahead with a private ceremony, complete with rings, vows, and a priest. The palace denied everything. Fitzherbert was painted as a hysterical mistress with delusions of grandeur. George himself publicly dismissed the rumors when it became politically convenient. But after his death, something inconvenient happened. The papers surfaced. Hidden away in a locked box, the marriage certificate and private correspondence between George and Maria were finally uncovered. Witnesses confirmed the ceremony had happened. The monarchy had lied. Not misunderstood. Not avoided. Lied. And why? Because the truth threatened the crown's Protestant foundations. If the heir to the throne had legally married a Catholic, even in secret, it could have triggered a constitutional crisis. So the state simply rewrote the story. They erased her from it. Maria Fitzherbert was never crowned, never titled, and yet she was, by every honest measure, the prince's first wife. Of course, once you've married someone you're forbidden to love, you might start wondering what other rules can be bent. Which brings us to the Mad King himself, and the uncomfortable truth no one at court dared say out loud. If you're still with us after that royal reveal, you're clearly the kind of person who appreciates a well-documented downfall, so go ahead and subscribe for more. And while you're spiraling with us through monarchy mayhem, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? Midnight scandal binge or accidental lunch break history lesson? We want to know. 3. George III suffered from mental illness. They called him Farmer George when they were being kind, and the Mad King when they weren't. For most of his reign, George III was the punchline of the British Empire, the monarch who lost America, talked to trees, and confused his own servants for ancient Romans. But here's the thing. The court didn't want anyone laughing, because laughter meant truth, and truth meant weakness. So the rumor of madness had to be crushed. At first, there were murmurs, strange absences, confused speeches in Parliament, long walks where the king seemed to be speaking not just to himself, but to people who weren't there. Official statements chalked it up to exhaustion, a passing fever, perhaps a reaction to medication. But the servants knew, the physicians knew, his own sons definitely knew, and the rumors only grew louder. It wasn't until decades after his death that medical diaries surfaced, some handwritten by the royal physicians themselves. They didn't describe a mild eccentric. They described a man in extreme psychological distress. He suffered from what we would now call bipolar disorder, possibly made worse by a genetic condition. His episodes were severe and prolonged. During some, he was restrained. During others, isolated for months at a time. The monarchy couldn't afford a mad king. So they built a system around his illness. They installed a regent, propped up public appearances, and quietly managed his absence from the spotlight. The fiction of stability was maintained by burying the man behind it. But why hide it? Because acknowledging mental illness at the highest level meant questioning the divine right to rule. And the last thing the monarchy wanted was to appear human. Still, George III's madness haunts the institution like a suppressed memory. A royal mind collapsing under the weight of duty, secrecy, and inherited power. And if you think that was the worst secret a royal physician ever kept, wait until you hear how King George V's doctor sent him to the grave, with a little help from a syringe. 4. George V ordered doctors to hasten his death. It was supposed to be dignified. A king's passing, after all, is not like a common man's. There are rituals to uphold, silence to observe, curtains to draw. But when George V lay dying in 1936, what happened behind the royal bedchamber doors was less sacred and more strategic. For years, rumors had swirled around the details of his death. Too convenient, some said. Too tidy. He had been ill, yes, but stable one moment and gone the next. The palace announced he had passed peacefully in his sleep. The nation mourned. The monarchy moved on. And yet, something felt off. The story was just a little too clean. The truth didn't emerge until 1986, when the diary of Lord Dawson of Penn, George's personal physician, was released to the public. It read less like a medical record and more like a confession. The king, it turned out, hadn't died naturally. He had been helped along by a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine administered deliberately to ensure his death occurred before midnight. Why? because morning papers wouldn't have the right timing. Dawson wrote that he wanted the king's death to make the more respectable front pages of the Times, rather than risk a late-night slot in the less appropriate evening tabloids. This was not mercy. This was monarchy as brand management. A man's death stage managed for public relations. And it worked. The public never suspected a thing. For half a century, the image held. The wise, weathered king slipping gently into the night, not the patient who was euthanized without consent for the sake of media optics. The palace never officially addressed it. Why would they? That would mean admitting that royal life and royal death is sometimes as coldly calculated as a press release. Of course, some kings didn't need help dying. They lived fast, scandalously, and outrageously, like the monarch who spent his free time in Parisian brothels, surrounded by secret apartments, silk upholstery, and a chair that no one was supposed to talk about. 5. Edward VII had dozens of mistresses and secret houses. If walls could talk, Edward VII would have been seized for national security reasons. The man wasn't just a king. He was a walking scandal with a crown on top. Before he ever took the throne, Bertie was already infamous across Europe for one thing above all: his appetite. Officially, he was the heir apparent, the son of Queen Victoria, the dignified Prince of Wales. Unofficially, he was a chronic philanderer with a preference for actresses, aristocrats' wives, and anyone who could keep a secret. And that's the thing. Many didn't. The rumors were outrageous. Secret apartments, private clubs, and whole houses dedicated to his liaisons. It sounded like the kind of Victorian fiction people whispered about to entertain themselves. But then came the letters, too many to ignore. Biographers dug into archives, court records, and private correspondence. The rumors were true. All of them. In fact, reality was worse. Edward maintained a rotating cast of mistresses, including the famous Lily Langtry, Daisy Greville, and Alice Keppel, Camilla's great-grandmother, because history loves a callback. He didn't just visit these women, he set them up. Leased townhouses, sent gifts, paid staff. Whole side economies existed just to keep his escapades operational. It wasn't just reckless, it was strategic. Each mistress played a part, each home a safe haven. Some liaisons overlapped with diplomatic visits. Some caused international incidents. The French had a nickname for him, Edward the Caresser. And still, Queen Victoria pretended it wasn't happening. The palace denied it all, even as carriages rolled into secret courtyards and royal staff looked the other way. Edward's sins were tolerated because they were kept off the front page. Mostly. It wasn't until decades later that historians connected the dots, revealing not just a king with a sex life, but a monarchy built on denial, indulgence, and selective amnesia. And if you think all of that sounds salacious, just wait until you see what they built for him in Paris, a very real, very ornate, and very unspeakable piece of royal furniture. 6. Edward VII's royal sex chair actually existed. Some rumors sound so ridiculous they almost circle back to being believable, like the story of a velvet-upholstered mechanical chair built specifically to help a king cheat on his wife more efficiently. For decades, the so-called sex chair of Edward VII was dismissed as a crude urban myth, a dirty joke tacked onto the already scandalous legacy of the pleasure-loving prince. And yet, it's real. Not metaphorically, not poetically. A literal, custom-made wood and brass contraption, housed in a Parisian brothel called Le Chabanais, and still preserved to this day. Edward, known to Parisians as Prince Bertie, was a frequent guest at this elite establishment. Discretion was guaranteed, and the decor was less Victorian repression, more Belle Epoque fantasy. But even in that context, the chair stood out. It was designed to spare the prince's considerable frame from, let's say, unnecessary exertion. Eyewitness accounts, brothel records, client logs, and later testimonies describe the apparatus as a kind of support system, designed to allow Edward to recline while his partners remained mobile. Naturally, the palace never acknowledged it. When stories surfaced in the early 20th century, they were dismissed as French tabloid slander. After all, what respectable British monarch would commission furniture for that? But then the chair resurfaced, literally, preserved in private collections, documented by historians, photographed, and verified by curators. The French had kept it. They always do. And once again, the monarchy's denial collapsed under the weight of its own elaborate engineering. The chair, now on quiet display, isn't just an object. It's a relic of a monarchy that has always balanced its public morality with private indulgence. Edward VII's reign was built on contradiction. He was the dignified patriarch of the modern royal image, and the man who spent his nights in velvet-draped rooms behind false walls. But perhaps the most ironic part of the story is this. The man who needed custom furniture to support his romantic excesses died comfortably in bed, surrounded by family, forgiven by history. Meanwhile, his mother, Queen Victoria, had secrets of her own. Though hers weren't built of brass and upholstery, they were hidden in diary entries, wrapped in grief, and whispered through locked doors. 7. Queen Victoria had an emotionally intense relationship with John Brown. History remembers Queen Victoria as the stiff widow in black, mourning Prince Albert until the end of her days. But there was another figure who loomed just as large in her later life, and he wasn't royal, aristocratic, or even particularly polite. His name was John Brown, a Scottish servant who somehow became her closest confidant, emotional crutch, and, depending on which drawer of history you open, something even more intimate. The rumors began almost immediately. Brown was seen entering the Queen's private quarters at odd hours. He accompanied her alone on carriage rides. He was reportedly allowed to speak to her without formality, even calling her woman, and referring to himself as Her Majesty's Stallion to palace staff. "Scandalous," whispered the court. "Unseemly," declared Parliament. The Queen, for her part, didn't care. After Albert's death, Victoria was consumed by grief. John Brown, blunt and irreverent, seemed to shock her back to life. He brought whiskey, defied protocol, and protected her from public appearances she hated. In return, she gave him extraordinary access, personal gifts, and a standing far above his station. The royal household denied anything improper. The very idea of a monarch forming an emotional dependency, perhaps even a romantic one, with a servant was politically radioactive. Portraits of the two were destroyed. Letters vanished. But not all. Years after her death, surviving private correspondence confirmed what many suspected. The bond was deep, enduring, and far beyond a simple employer-employee relationship. Victoria's letters expressed affection, dependence, and something bordering on devotion. After Brown's death, she had a lock of his hair buried with her, and a photograph placed in her coffin. Not exactly protocol. Was it romantic? Was it physical? That part remains unprovable, and that's precisely what fuels the intrigue. What is undeniable is that a queen, known for moral rigidity, spent her later years emotionally tethered to a man the establishment could barely tolerate. But Brown wasn't the only outsider to occupy such a role. Years later, another man would take up the same space, close, controversial, and quietly erased by royal archivists. His name was Abdul Karim, and his influence went even deeper. 8. Victoria also had a secret, dependent relationship with Abdul Karim, the Munshi. You'd think the royal court would learn from history. But apparently, one emotionally intimate relationship with a servant wasn't enough for Queen Victoria. Enter Abdul Karim, an Indian clerk who arrived at court in 1887 and somehow ended up becoming her most trusted confidant during the last decade of her reign. They called him the Munshi, and he caused more chaos inside Buckingham Palace than most foreign enemies ever managed. At first, Karim was brought in as a novelty, a gift from India for Victoria's Golden Jubilee. He was meant to serve, be decorative, maybe teach her a few words of Hindustani. But within weeks, The Queen was captivated. Karim was promoted rapidly, bypassing dozens of other staff. He dined alone with her, gave her lessons in Urdu, advised her on Indian affairs, and signed his letters with titles typically reserved for family. The court, unsurprisingly, erupted. The racial and class panic was immediate and vicious. Letters from courtiers described Karim as insolent, manipulative, and dangerously influential. The Queen, of course, defended him with ferocity. She overruled objections, dismissed critics, and even took Karim on extended royal visits, infuriating her own children in the process. But the real scandal wasn't just the relationship itself, it was the cover-up that followed. After Victoria's death in 1901, Edward VII ordered Karim's immediate dismissal. The royal household raided his home, seized letters, and demanded he return every trace of correspondence with the Queen. Diaries were destroyed, memoirs silenced. The official story became, he was a minor servant, nothing more. That narrative held for over a century. Then, in the 21st century, historians began uncovering long-lost journals written by Victoria herself. In her own handwriting, she described Karim in glowing terms: affectionate, emotional, and deeply personal. He wasn't a footnote. He was a central figure in her final years. The scandal, long buried under imperial racism and court paranoia, came back to life. And yet, even as the monarchy erased him, it clung to its own secrets. Because while Victoria was forming private attachments with forbidden companions, her extended family was quietly locking away their own flesh and blood, under the guise of shame, protection, and silence. 9. Victoria's family hid relatives with severe disabilities. There are many ways to exile someone. You can send them to another country. You can strip their titles. Or, if you're the British royal family in the 20th century, you can simply pretend they died, while quietly hiding them in a mental institution. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon were first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II, born into aristocratic privilege, baptized into high society, and then swiftly erased from it. The story the public was told? They died young. Early deaths, tragic but unremarkable. No further questions. The truth? They were very much alive, just inconvenient. Both women had severe developmental disabilities. By the time they were in their early 20s, they were declared unfit to be seen in public and were committed to the Royal Earlswood Institution for Mental Defectives. There, they remained for decades, forgotten by the public, ignored by most of their family, and listed as dead in official Berks peerage records. This wasn't a clerical error. It was deliberate. Journalists didn't uncover the truth until the 1980s, when a documentary crew stumbled upon hospital records confirming the women were alive, well past the dates they'd supposedly died. When confronted, the palace had no real defense, only stammered statements and evasive PR lines about private family matters. Private, yes, but also calculated. The decision to hide the sisters wasn't just about shame, it was about image. The royal family, especially during the reign of George VI and Elizabeth II, was desperate to project a myth of strength, dignity, and hereditary superiority. Having close relatives with disabilities threatened that illusion. So they were locked away, not because of what they did, but because of what they were. For decades, no senior royal visited them. No cards, no birthdays, no public acknowledgement. Nerissa died in 1986, with no flowers sent from the palace. Catherine survived until 2014, with little more than a nurse and silence to mark her passing. They were family, but only when it was convenient. And if you think that's cold, wait until you learn what else Queen Victoria's bloodline passed down. Something far more invisible, yet far more deadly, and it changed the face of European royalty forever. 10. Queen Victoria was a carrier of hemophilia. It was called the royal disease, an ironic title for something so undignified. Hemophilia, a rare genetic disorder that prevents blood from clotting properly, quietly threaded its way through the veins of Europe's nobility, like a hereditary time bomb. And at the center of it all? Queen Victoria. For years, whispers surrounded the unusually fragile health of some of her descendants. Victoria's own son, Leopold, bled easily and bruised worse. But no one wanted to suggest something as scandalous as a genetic defect in the royal bloodline. That would imply weakness. Worse, it would imply responsibility. The rumors picked up speed when multiple royal heirs across Europe, especially in Russia, Spain, and Germany, began suffering from similar symptoms. Coincidence? Hardly. The more genealogists mapped the family tree, the clearer it became. Queen Victoria was the original carrier. She had passed the gene to her daughters, who married into Europe's most powerful families, spreading hemophilia across generations like an invisible curse. For a long time, the palace said little. Official biographies skirted the issue. Medical records were kept vague. The monarchy wasn't in the business of admitting that the most powerful woman in the world had, inadvertently, doomed dozens of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren to lives of fragility and early death. Modern science, however, is indifferent to legacy. Genetic testing confirmed it. Victoria was a spontaneous carrier of the hemophilia B mutation, likely due to a genetic change during her own conception. From her, the gene spread through the royal houses of Russia, see Tsarevich Alexei, Spain, and Prussia, like an aristocratic plague. It wasn't just a medical issue, it was a geopolitical one. In Russia, the Tsarevich's illness contributed to the rise of Rasputin, distrust in the royal family, and, eventually, the Russian Revolution. A disease helped topple an empire, and it started with a queen who never knew what lurked in her blood. But if illness hid in the royal bloodstream, mystery clung to royal deathbeds. And as for Prince Albert, Victoria's beloved husband, his official cause of death was typhoid, until of course someone actually checked the symptoms. 11. Prince Albert didn't die of typhoid. When Prince Albert died in 1861, the nation plunged into mourning. Queen Victoria plunged into black. For decades, the official record said he succumbed to typhoid fever, sudden, tragic, a textbook Victorian demise. But as the years rolled on, the story began to rot at the edges. Doctors at the time noted vague symptoms: abdominal pain, fatigue, weight loss. Not exactly rare in 19th century Britain, where waterborne diseases flourished and doctors preferred guesswork over diagnosis. Still, it made for a clean narrative. Typhoid was understandable, palatable, a respectable death for a respectable prince. Except it wasn't true. Modern medical historians began revisiting the case, and the more they looked, the less sense it made. Albert had been ill for years, not days. His decline was slow, not sudden. His symptoms, chronic stomach problems, persistent pain, changes in behavior, aligned more closely with something else entirely. Possibly Crohn's disease or a form of stomach cancer. Not typhoid. Not even close. But back then, admitting that a royal died of something lingering and undignified wasn't an option. Chronic illness implied vulnerability. Vulnerability implied political instability. The monarchy needed a tidy story, and typhoid was as good a euphemism as any. Victoria accepted the official explanation, or at least pretended to. She threw herself into mourning with a theatrical flair that bordered on obsession. She wore black for the rest of her life. She built statues. She refused to sit in the same room without his portrait. And yet, for all her performative grief, she never questioned the medical narrative. Or if she did, she kept the doubt buried. But even death couldn't escape historical revision. The post-mortem theories stuck. Medical experts agree today. Albert likely died from a gastrointestinal condition the royal doctors couldn't or wouldn't name. Which raises an uncomfortable point. If one royal consort's death was sanitized, how many others were rewritten for public consumption? That question becomes even more uncomfortable when you realize how far a future king would go to hide his unsavory political sympathies. Ones involving a little mustached man in Germany, and a royal future that could have changed the world. 12. Edward VIII had Nazi sympathies. History likes its villains loud and its monarchs silent, but sometimes the lines blur, and what you get is Edward VIII, the king who waved too warmly at fascists. Long before his 11-month reign ended in royal resignation, Edward VIII had already alarmed the establishment, not just because of Wallace Simpson or his distaste for protocol, but because of the way he looked at Germany. Admiringly, curiously, a bit too fondly. Rumors that Edward had fascist leanings were dismissed as post-abdication bitterness. Supporters insisted he was merely pro-peace or diplomatically open-minded. But behind closed doors, officials were panicking. He had visited Germany in 1937, after abdicating but still very much a royal figure, and met with Hitler. There were handshakes, smiles, Nazi salutes, and photographs that would haunt the monarchy for decades. For years, the palace maintained he was simply being polite. The meeting, they claimed, was unofficial, meaningless. But buried in the archives were letters and memos that told a different story, one of admiration, not obligation. Eventually, documents began to surface. British intelligence files, German diplomatic communications, intercepted telegrams. They revealed Edward had expressed sympathy for Hitler's regime, believed fascism could be a useful buffer against communism, and suggested bombing might convince Britain to negotiate peace. He wasn't just a misguided tourist. He was a risk. Even Churchill, not known for his subtlety, warned about Edward's views. The government monitored his movements, intercepted his correspondence, and quietly made sure he stayed far from power. He was exiled to the Bahamas during World War II, not as a favor, but as containment. Today, the photos still exist. So do the transcripts. Edward's defenders call him naive. His critics call him dangerous. But one thing is clear. When the world was choosing sides, the former King of England almost chose the wrong one. And he wasn't alone. Because while Edward posed for handshakes, the woman he loved had a few shadows of her own, tracked, recorded, and filed by two of the most powerful intelligence agencies on Earth. 13. Wallace Simpson was monitored due to Nazi connections. Wallace Simpson was supposed to be the scandal. Twice divorced. American. Unacceptably modern. But beneath the pearl-clutching headlines about her love life was a quieter, darker rumor. That she had Nazi sympathies. And worse, Nazi connections. The British government watched her from early on, but they weren't the only ones. As her relationship with Edward grew, so did the attention from intelligence services on both sides of the Atlantic. By the late 1930s, Wallace was being monitored by MI5 in Britain and the FBI in the United States. Not because of her marital status, but because of who she knew, who she spoke to, and what she might say when no one was supposed to be listening. She had ties, friendly, persistent, and suspicious, to German diplomats stationed in London and Paris. There were recorded meetings with Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, who was rumored, even at the time, to have sent her 17 carnations as a romantic gesture. It sounds absurd, until you realize that British officials took it seriously enough to put her under surveillance. Declassified MI5 files confirm the government's concern. Wallace might have been a conduit for Nazi messaging. Not a spy necessarily, but a sympathizer. A useful channel. She reportedly spoke positively about Germany's order, and once allegedly said Hitler was not such a bad chap. In isolation, maybe these were just poor judgments. But in context, within a Europe on the brink of war, and a former king potentially playing diplomat in exile, they were dangerous. The FBI's files were no less damning. J. Edgar Hoover personally ensured that Wallace's name was on several watch lists. American intelligence feared she might serve as a pawn, or worse, an active participant, in German propaganda efforts targeting Britain. None of this was ever officially confirmed during her lifetime. The royal family maintained silence. The public was fed the usual sanitized versions: a tragic romance, a misunderstood woman. But the paper trail tells a more disturbing story. One of state-level suspicion, transatlantic dossiers, and a royal couple who made all the wrong friends. And as for Edward, he didn't stop at sympathy. He started handing out state secrets, just not to the state he once ruled. 14. Edward VIII leaked state documents to the Nazis. If Edward VIII had simply retired to a quiet villa and spent his days gardening, history might have forgiven him. But instead, he wandered into far more treacherous terrain, specifically into the realm of treason light. Rumors that Edward had leaked British government information to the Nazis circulated almost immediately after his abdication. At the time, they were dismissed as bitter speculation, fuel for angry tabloids and disapproving courtiers. After all, how could a former king, the very symbol of British stability, pass sensitive documents to an enemy power? But after World War II ended, the Allies made a discovery that changed everything. As Nazi offices were ransacked and archives seized, a curious set of diplomatic documents came to light. Among them were German Foreign Office files confirming that Edward had passed along classified British state information during his time in exile. These weren't just vague political opinions. These were actual pieces of correspondence, telegrams, strategy discussions, and diplomatic memos intended only for government eyes. Captured German records described Edward and Wallace as sympathetic to the Nazi cause and willing to share intelligence they received through private channels. Worse still, the documents suggested that the Germans viewed Edward as a potential asset, a man who might, under the right circumstances, be restored to the British throne if Germany succeeded in its plans. The British government, horrified, buried the findings. Churchill demanded that certain documents be suppressed, and for decades, the most damning files were kept sealed under a pretense of diplomatic sensitivity. Only when historians unearthed them in the late 20th century did the full picture emerge. Edward VIII had not just admired the Nazis. He had actively undermined the nation he once ruled. Of course, the monarchy issued no official response. The narrative of a love-struck king sacrificing his crown for romance was far more palatable than the alternative, that he may have jeopardized national security from behind a polished smile. And it didn't stop there. Because for a brief, terrifying moment, Edward wasn't just sympathizing or leaking, he was being considered, by the Nazis themselves, as a puppet king for a conquered Britain. 15. Edward VIII wanted to return as a Nazi-backed puppet king. Sometimes history offers up a rumor so surreal you hope it's fiction. One such tale? That the Nazis planned to reinstall Edward VIII as King of Britain, after Germany invaded and took control, of course. A plot that would have turned Buckingham Palace into a satellite office for the Third Reich. Completely absurd, right? Except it wasn't. The plan had a name: Operation Willy. It was cooked up by high-ranking Nazis in 1940, after Edward and Wallace fled France for neutral Spain. Hitler's thinking was simple: restore Edward, make him king again, and use him as a diplomatic leash to control the British government. Edward, the theory went, would be more amenable to German interests, if not outright cooperative. At the time, the British government dismissed these rumors as propaganda. The press, kept on a tight leash, spun the couple's presence in Europe as unfortunate timing. But behind closed doors, Churchill and his cabinet were panicking. Edward's behavior wasn't exactly reassuring. He refused multiple government orders to return to Britain, delayed his travel, and spent weeks in Europe meeting with questionable individuals, many with known Nazi affiliations. Diplomatic telegrams later declassified confirmed the worst. He was stalling. Not by accident, but by design. The Germans, meanwhile, were giddy. Captured Nazi documents revealed the seriousness of their plan. They believed Edward could be used to legitimize an occupation. They even discussed kidnapping him if he didn't cooperate. He was, in their eyes, the perfect blend of royalty and pliability. Churchill, recognizing the risk, quickly moved him to the Bahamas under the guise of a governorship. It wasn't a promotion, it was exile, with palm trees. The British government's goal was simple: Isolate him, contain him, and let time bury the scandal. And for the most part, it worked. The Operation Willie files remained obscure for decades, but the blueprint for royal treachery had been drawn, and it came shockingly close to becoming reality. Of course, not all royal secrets are about global betrayal. Some are closer to home, tucked inside a stammer, a microphone, and the desperate rehearsal of a man who never wanted the crown. 16. George VI hid his stammer with rehearsed scripts. Royalty thrives on illusion. The illusion of perfection, control, and confidence, especially when it speaks. For George VI, the illusion required rehearsal, breath control, and the courage to speak in front of millions while knowing every word might betray him. The rumors of his speech impediment followed him quietly for years. Even before he was thrust into the spotlight by his brother's abdication, those close to the royal court knew that Albert, the Duke of York, struggled with words. He was not the natural orator his role demanded. Public speaking brought visible anxiety. Sentences snagged in his throat. And in the era of radio, there was no hiding behind parchment or protocol. But the palace worked hard to control the narrative. His speeches were edited, meticulously rehearsed, and heavily coached. Microphones were strategically positioned to minimize stumbles. It was all done behind the curtain, of course. To the public, he was simply a shy but earnest king, a reluctant leader thrust into history's glare. It wasn't until long after his death that the full extent of his efforts and suffering came to light. Coaching notes, private letters, and recorded practice sessions revealed the immense psychological toll his stammer took on him. His work with speech therapist Lionel Logue wasn't just cinematic legend, it was real, and it was exhaustive. The pair worked tirelessly before every major address, often rehearsing each word dozens of times. Breathing techniques, emotional support, annotated scripts. The king's voice became a carefully constructed performance. The success of those speeches, especially his wartime broadcasts, was not a natural triumph. It was a testament to struggle, discipline, and silent torment. Behind the confidence was a man afraid of his own voice. And while the world applauded the king who conquered his stammer, another member of the royal family was quietly vanishing from the public eye. A prince, hidden in a country estate, whose condition wasn't rehearsed away, but entirely removed from view. 17. The palace covered up the truth about Prince John's condition. Every family has its secrets. The royal family builds entire estates to house them. Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, was once photographed smiling beside his siblings, posing for formal portraits like any other young royal. But as he grew older, those appearances stopped. Public mentions disappeared, and by the time he died at just 13, he had already become a ghost. Rumors swirled for decades that he had epilepsy, that he was mentally disabled, that he had been exiled to Sandringham, never seen again. The palace, as expected, offered little more than vague condolences and tight-lipped explanations. A tragic loss, they called it. A quiet child. The details? None offered. But then came the diaries, the photographs, the letters, buried deep in archives, slowly uncovered by persistent historians. They confirmed the truth long suspected. Prince John had epilepsy and significant developmental challenges. Rather than receive care within the palace walls, he was moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate and effectively hidden from public life. Even within the family, his absence was palpable. Letters from his siblings expressed sorrow, guilt, and confusion. Queen Mary, though reportedly devoted in private, followed court advice to keep him out of sight. Public appearances would have raised difficult questions the monarchy had no interest in answering. When John died in 1919 after a severe seizure, his funeral was small and quiet. No grand state mourning, no memorial portrait hanging in the halls. For decades, his existence was footnoted, if acknowledged at all. Only in recent years has his story begun to emerge fully, reframing him not as a forgotten royal, but as a child born into the wrong family at the wrong time, when disability was seen as shameful, and image was everything. His story is not unique, but it's telling. Because just as the monarchy erased John from the public eye, it would later try to downplay another royal's headline-making habits. Though this time, it wasn't seizures or solitude. It was cigarettes, champagne, and a nightclub tab that never ended. 18. Princess Margaret's wild nightlife rumors were true. For a long time, Princess Margaret was the monarchy's designated problem child. Glamorous, unpredictable, and dangerously charismatic. While her sister, Queen Elizabeth II, embodied stoic duty, Margaret preferred martinis at noon and parties that started after midnight. The palace tried, desperately, to keep her nightlife under wraps. They failed. Rumors of Margaret's after-dark antics were dismissed as tabloid exaggeration, nasty gossip meant to tarnish a woman who refused to be boring. She was seen leaving clubs in the early hours, photographed on yachts, and whispered about in connection with artists, actors, and the occasional married man. The official line? Nonsense. The royal sister was simply free-spirited. But the stories kept coming, and over time, so did the proof. Biographers, former staff, and even party guests began painting a far more vivid picture. Margaret was a regular fixture in London's most exclusive clubs. Annabelle's, Tramp, and the kind of private drawing rooms where everyone was someone and secrets were a currency. She chain-smoked in public, drank heavily in private. Her circle included Mick Jagger, Peter Sellers, and anyone who could keep her entertained or distracted. The palace issued polite denials, but the photos didn't lie. Neither did the accounts of those who watched her disappear into country estates with a cocktail in hand and a jazz band already playing inside. Her reputation for wild weekends wasn't rumor. It was calendar. More than scandalous, Margaret was tragic in the way only royalty can be. Born into power but shackled by image. Denied the love of her life. Given endless attention but little purpose. So she entertained herself. She leaned into excess. And she let the world talk, knowing it couldn't touch her. Except it could. Because while the press called her the royal rebel, the palace was quietly preparing for the fallout from her next headline. A public affair with a much younger man, captured on camera, sunbathing in a place where royals weren't supposed to tan. 19. Princess Margaret's affair with Roddy Llewellyn. When the photos hit the front pages in 1976, they were more than scandal. They were confirmation. There was Princess Margaret, now in her mid-40s, on a Caribbean island with a man 17 years younger, shirtless, lounging beside her like a scene from a romance novel no one at Buckingham Palace wanted to read. His name was Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener of all things, and their relationship had been quietly unfolding for years. The rumors began as whispers among socialites and the kind of reporters who hung around private clubs waiting for royals to slip up. But once the tabloids got their pictures, the palace couldn't spin it away. The affair was real, and it was on every newsstand in Britain. Roddy wasn't just a fling. He was a symptom of something deeper. Margaret's growing detachment from a life that increasingly felt ornamental. After the breakdown of her marriage to photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, she seemed adrift. The public still wanted a fairy tale. Margaret gave them a sunburned love story instead. Predictably, the establishment went into meltdown. Politicians fretted over what it meant for the monarchy. The Queen reportedly was less than amused. And Margaret? She barely flinched. She'd long understood that her real power lay in ignoring protocol rather than upholding it. Roddy became a regular feature in Margaret's life, despite the disapproval. They traveled together, appeared at events together, and though the relationship eventually faded, it left a permanent mark, not just on Margaret's image, but on the monarchy's illusion of dignity. The palace has always been most scandalized not by immorality, but by visibility. Affairs, drinking, rebellion, they're fine, as long as they stay inside the palace gates. Margaret shattered that illusion with a camera flash and a plane ticket. And she wasn't the last, because the next royal scandal would involve betrayal, recordings, and a phone call no one was ever supposed to hear, one that proved an affair long denied and far more compromising than a beach romance. 20. Prince Charles and Camilla had a long-running affair. For decades, the official story was one of tragic timing. Prince Charles and Camilla Shand had been close friends, then drifted apart, and later, after the failure of Charles and Diana's marriage, fate had brought them back together, older, wiser, ready for love. That version is a masterclass in palace PR. The truth is less tidy. The affair between Charles and Camilla didn't begin after his marriage to Diana. It never really stopped. Even during the height of royal fairy tales and televised weddings, the two maintained a deep, consistent connection. The palace denied it, of course. For years, any claim of infidelity was labeled defamatory, cruel, or false. Charles, after all, was the heir to the throne. Camilla was married to someone else. And Diana? She was the public's princess, draped in innocence and isolation. Then came the leak. In 1993, a private phone call between Charles and Camilla, recorded years earlier, was released to the press. It was awkward, intimate, cringe-inducing, and completely, undeniably real. Nicknamed Tampongate, the call was filled with personal admissions, emotional neediness, and more than a little embarrassment for the future king. Suddenly, the rumors weren't rumors. The affair was fact, and the monarchy was rattled. More than a PR crisis, the leak revealed the emotional messiness behind the royal curtain. Charles wasn't just cheating, he was emotionally dependent on Camilla, even while married to Diana. The idea of arranged royal duty crumbled. The fairy tale had become a triangle. In time, the palace would rehabilitate the narrative. Charles and Camilla eventually married, officially rebranding decades of deceit as enduring love. But the damage was already done. Trust had eroded. And Diana, once the outsider, became the public's tragic heroine. But if you think the betrayal ended with a phone call, it didn't. Because Charles and Camilla weren't just carrying on an affair, they were also working behind the scenes, coordinating, planning, ensuring that one woman would never fully belong inside the royal circle again. 21. Charles and Camilla plotted behind Diana's back. Affairs are messy. Palaces are messier. By the early 1990s, it had become clear that Charles and Camilla weren't just in love. They were organized. Behind the scenes, while the public watched a marriage crumble in slow motion, Charles and Camilla were setting the stage for a quiet reclamation of power. Not just personal, but institutional. The story the palace preferred was one of circumstance. Charles and Diana had grown apart, and Camilla re-entered his life by accident. In reality, Charles and Camilla maintained regular communication, mutual allies, and a coordinated plan to restore Camilla's image while sidelining Diana's. Multiple royal biographers and insiders have since confirmed what many suspected at the time. Camilla wasn't simply waiting in the wings. She was being coached, protected, and positioned. Charles's PR team worked subtly but effectively to reframe her in the media. Less homewrecker, more misunderstood soulmate. At the same time, Diana began noticing shifts in the palace machinery. Invitations excluded her. Royal staff changed loyalties. Press briefings grew colder. She wasn't paranoid. She was being edged out. Diana's famous quote in the 1995 Panorama interview, "There were 3 of us in this marriage," wasn't metaphorical flourish. It was tactical truth. She'd come to realize that not only was Charles emotionally committed to another woman, but that his inner circle was actively smoothing the path for that woman's eventual acceptance. The public backlash to the interview was seismic, but inside the palace, it only deepened the divide. Charles and Camilla doubled down on damage control, while Diana became increasingly isolated. The princess was no longer just a wife. She was a PR liability. Years later, their strategy paid off. Charles and Camilla married. She became the Duchess of Cornwall, and eventually, after Elizabeth II's death, Queen Consort. The scandal was rebranded as romance, and history was asked to play along. But Diana had left behind more than just headlines. She left tapes, warnings, and a haunting suspicion that her erasure was more than social. It was strategic, and she wasn't entirely sure she'd make it out alive. 22. Diana suspected she was being silenced. It started with whispers in the press, shadows in the hallway, and phones that clicked at strange moments. For Princess Diana, paranoia didn't feel like paranoia. It felt like preparation. She was the most photographed woman in the world, but behind closed doors, she began to suspect she was being erased in a far more deliberate way. The palace, of course, had its version. Diana was emotional. She was vulnerable. She was overwhelmed. But the rumors that she was being managed, or worse, silenced, refused to die. She spoke in code to friends, avoided certain phones, chose cars over calls, and then came the tapes. During secret interviews recorded in Kensington Palace, Diana revealed her growing belief that her life was being controlled, and that her downfall was being orchestrated. "If I'm not careful," she said, "they will get rid of me." It wasn't theatrical. It was weary, and it was chilling. She spoke of her fears that her car was being tampered with, that she was being followed, that every mistake she made, every public stumble, was being used to build a narrative of instability, one that might justify her removal from royal life and from public sympathy. These recordings weren't discovered years later. They were part of her own plan. She gave them to trusted allies to safeguard her side of the story in case the worst happened. She knew that, once gone, the royal version would be the only one left standing. Critics at the time dismissed her fears as melodrama, but subsequent investigations into her treatment, by the media, by courtiers, and even by security services, suggested her concerns weren't so far-fetched. Surveillance? Highly likely. Press leaks from inside the palace? Absolutely confirmed. Diana felt hunted because, in many ways, she was. And beneath it all was something deeper than a conspiracy. It was the unbearable pressure of a system that needed her image, but not her truth. That would keep her beautiful, charitable, and tragic, as long as she stayed quiet. But Diana didn't stay quiet. In fact, she exposed one of the most tightly guarded secrets of her royal life, one the palace spent years denying until the truth came straight from her own voice. 23. Diana's bulimia and mental health struggles. For a royal institution obsessed with image, few things were more threatening than vulnerability, especially the kind that couldn't be dressed up, smoothed over, or hidden behind a balcony wave. So when rumors began to swirl in the 1980s that Princess Diana was struggling with an eating disorder, the palace went into defense mode. Deny, dismiss, distract. At the time, tabloids speculated with glee. Photos showed Diana looking thinner. Reports surfaced of fainting spells, erratic moods, and missed appointments. But the official line was unwavering. The princess was healthy, radiant, and just under pressure. Privately, she was unraveling. The truth only came out when Diana made the choice to say it herself. In taped interviews with her biographer Andrew Morton, later compiled in the explosive book Diana, Her True Story, she revealed her long struggle with bulimia, which began shortly after her engagement to Charles. She described it as a coping mechanism in a world where she felt voiceless and constantly scrutinized. "I didn't like myself. I was ashamed because I couldn't cope with the pressures." The admission was revolutionary, not just for a royal to speak so openly about mental health, but for anyone of her visibility to publicly name a disorder still wrapped in shame. It shattered the fairy tale. It rehumanized the icon, and it horrified the monarchy. Diana also spoke of self-harm, depression, and the intense loneliness of life inside the gilded cage. She wasn't simply sad, she was unwell and getting worse. And while the world admired her style and poise, she was barely holding on behind closed doors. The palace refused to acknowledge the revelations. Their silence was, in many ways, an indictment. It was easier to let the public speculate than to confront the idea that one of the most visible royals of the century was suffering, and doing it alone. Diana's courage in naming her illness cracked something open in the public's perception of the monarchy. Suddenly, vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was strength. And the idea that this perfect royal marriage had ever existed began to look like the biggest illusion of all. 24. Diana's marriage was arranged and unhappy from the start. From the outside, it had all the ingredients of a royal fairy tale: the blushing bride, the heir to the throne, the towering cathedral, and the white dress that practically swallowed the aisle. But behind the spectacle of Diana's 1981 wedding to Prince Charles was a union built on protocol, pressure, and a stunning lack of compatibility. Rumors that the marriage had been arranged, or at least heavily engineered, surfaced almost immediately. Diana was 19, sheltered and selected. Charles was 32, already emotionally entangled with Camilla Parker Bowles. The royal family needed a bride who was young, aristocratic, and pliable. Diana fit the role. It was never about love. It was about optics. At the time, the palace denied any suggestion that the match was orchestrated. They sold it as a whirlwind romance, delicately timed and utterly mutual. But the truth, as Diana later revealed, was that the engagement moved at an alarming pace, one she barely understood, let alone controlled. In private interviews, Diana described her wedding day as the worst day of my life. She felt trapped before she even reached the altar. She had discovered Charles was still involved with Camilla, and when she confronted him, the response was evasive at best. "Whatever love means," Charles famously said when asked about their engagement, a phrase that aged like milk in the years to come. Their incompatibility was obvious early on. She was emotionally expressive, desperate for connection. He was distant, cerebral, still tied to another woman. Behind palace doors, Diana felt isolated and increasingly unstable. The public saw the fairy tale. She lived the farce. Letters, recorded phone calls, and interviews with close friends and staff confirmed what the tabloids only hinted at. This was not a love story gone wrong. It was a marriage designed for royal continuity, doomed by emotional vacancy, and made unbearable by constant intrusion. And yet, even through the cold formality of royal life, Diana endured the sharpest pain of all. Not public scrutiny, but private betrayal. The kind that comes not from strangers or the press, but from the family she married into. 25. Prince Philip made racist or offensive remarks. Prince Philip was the monarchy's master of the unfiltered moment. Sharp-tongued, blunt, and, depending on who you asked, refreshingly frank or deeply inappropriate. For decades, rumors circulated that the Duke of Edinburgh had a habit of saying things that were not exactly palace-approved. And for just as long, those remarks were dismissed as gaffes, misunderstood jokes, or quaint relics of an older generation. But the list kept growing. Comments made to foreign dignitaries, students, citizens, and reporters were eventually cataloged like royal bloopers. Except they weren't bloopers. They were consistent patterns of racially charged and culturally insensitive remarks, documented, transcribed, and broadcast around the world. There was the time he told British students in China, "If you stay here much longer, you'll all be slitty-eyed." Or when he asked an indigenous Australian if they still throw spears. Or when he remarked to a black politician, "And what exotic part of the world do you come from?" These weren't rumors. They were on record, often captured on video. The palace's strategy was to frame them as harmless quips from a man of another era. But as society shifted, the excuses wore thin. By the 2010s, public scrutiny of his comments intensified. Social commentators and politicians began questioning why such language was tolerated, especially from a member of a family that represents national unity and global diplomacy. Philip, for his part, rarely apologized. His defenders argued he was merely unscripted, a casualty of rigid royal life trying to liven things up. But critics noted that his humor consistently targeted people from minority backgrounds or foreign nations. It wasn't randomness, it was bias, poorly disguised as banter. Even after his death, conversations about his remarks continued to resurface in documentaries and analyses of the royal family's relationship with race. They aren't footnotes anymore. They're part of the public record. And while Philip's mouth made headlines, his private life stirred quieter speculation, particularly his close friendships with women outside his marriage. The kind of relationships the palace never confirmed, but certainly never denied. 26. Prince Philip had close friendships with women outside his marriage. The official portrait of Prince Philip was one of duty, loyalty, and sardonic quips, a man who stood one respectful pace behind the Queen for over 7 decades. But behind the carefully curated image, the Duke of Edinburgh lived a life full of private friendships, whispered rumors, and a tightly sealed vault of royal discretion. For years, speculation surrounded Philip's relationships with a series of women, aristocrats, actresses, artists, most of them described by the palace as close friends. The term became a sort of polite shorthand. It implied everything and confirmed nothing. The palace, true to form, denied all claims of impropriety. Any suggestion of romantic entanglement was dismissed as malicious gossip. And yet the list of women connected to Philip was extensive, and their presence was not fleeting. They appeared at private events, shared exclusive correspondence, and were seen in Philip's company during periods when royal duties kept him otherwise away from the Queen. One of the most frequently mentioned names was Penny Natchbull, Countess Mountbatten of Burma. Over 30 years his junior, she was Philip's frequent companion at carriage-driving events, and reportedly one of the very few people allowed to visit him in his later years. Then there were actresses like Pat Kirkwood, who claimed to have dined alone with Philip in the 1940s. And of course, the ever-persistent rumors of stage stars, dancers, and society women from London to New York. Biographers and former palace staff have confirmed that these relationships were genuine, intimate, emotional, and long-lasting. Whether or not they crossed the line into romantic territory remains deliberately ambiguous. Philip's personal secretary once remarked, "You'll never prove anything, and you'll never disprove it either." That was the point. The royal family doesn't confess, it outlasts. Philip's friendships may have remained discreet, but his son would soon bring a different kind of attention to the family. Less romantic intrigue, more international disgrace. The kind that couldn't be laughed off, covered up, or politely ignored. The headlines weren't whispers anymore. They were shouting a name the monarchy wished it could unhear. 27. Prince Andrew's party prince behavior. Before he was a walking scandal, Prince Andrew was just a headline waiting to happen. In the 1980s and 90s, he earned the nickname Randy Andy from the British tabloids, a moniker less affectionate than it sounded. The palace tried to paint him as a charming bachelor, the adventurous naval officer living life to the fullest. But the stories from behind the velvet ropes told a different tale. Lavish parties, late-night escapades, and a taste for excess that rarely stayed discreet. The rumors of his behavior were everywhere. He was frequently seen in London's most exclusive clubs, partying with models, actresses, and socialites. Staff described him as demanding, arrogant, and entitled. One footman famously referred to him as his royal rudeness. The media played it all for laughs at first, but over time the tone darkened. Accounts from partygoers, staff, and acquaintances painted a picture of a prince who lived without consequence. His name opened doors, his title shielded him from scrutiny, and his entourage helped smooth over the messes. There were reports of unpaid bills, arrogant outbursts, and relationships with women decades younger. The palace maintained silence, hoping the noise would pass. But the stories piled up. Financial records showed absurd spending habits. Leaked memos hinted at tense meetings between royal aides tasked with damage control. Even former girlfriends spoke out, some tactfully, others not so much, about his temper and lack of judgment. The behavior might have been shrugged off as upper-class indulgence, if not for what came next. Because Andrew's party lifestyle didn't stay confined to society circles. It drifted into darker company. Much darker. The kind of people whose names weren't just in gossip columns but in sealed indictments. The royal family, once merely embarrassed by Andrew's antics, now found itself facing a crisis it couldn't drink, spend, or spin its way out of. The party prince image had become radioactive, and his connections were about to explode into the most damaging scandal the monarchy had faced in a generation. 28. Prince Andrew's links to Jeffrey Epstein. When Prince Andrew was first photographed with Jeffrey Epstein in Central Park, the palace shrugged. A private citizen, they said. A misunderstanding. Just old acquaintances catching up. But the photo didn't go away. Neither did the questions. And soon, it wasn't just a rumor. It was a diplomatic scandal, with a royal at its center. Jeffrey Epstein was already a convicted sex offender by the time Andrew was seen visiting him in New York in 2010. That visit, made shortly after Epstein's release from jail, wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. Andrew stayed at Epstein's townhouse for several days, reportedly unaware or unconcerned about the optics. When asked later why he did it, he replied it was a convenient place to stay. The palace issued denials, but the facts stacked up. There were flight logs, photos, testimonies. Most damning of all was the now infamous image of Andrew with his arm around Virginia Giuffre, a woman who later alleged she had been trafficked by Epstein and forced into sexual encounters with the prince. The palace called the photo fake. Andrew said he had no memory of meeting her, but the public wasn't buying it. As more details emerged from U.S. investigations and court filings, Andrew's name kept resurfacing. He had flown on Epstein's private jet. He had attended parties. Witnesses placed him at key locations. Even other members of Epstein's circle confirmed that Andrew was more than just a casual acquaintance. By 2019, the pressure was too great. Andrew sat down for a BBC interview meant to clear his name. Instead, it ended his public life. He denied the allegations in a performance so tone-deaf and evasive that even his staunchest defenders winced. The fallout was swift. He was stripped of royal duties, military titles, and public appearances. The Epstein connection wasn't just damaging, it was radioactive. The monarchy had long survived scandal, but this was different. There were victims, there were legal cases, and worst of all, there was evidence. But even as Andrew vanished from public view, one uncomfortable question remained. How long had the palace known? And just how far had it gone to protect him from the spotlight he now couldn't escape? 29. Andrew's involvement in sexual misconduct accusations. At first, the accusations were met with the usual royal toolkit: silence, legalese, and institutional indignation. When Virginia Giuffre publicly alleged that she had been trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein and forced to have encounters with Prince Andrew as a teenager, Buckingham Palace issued a brief, sterile denial. No acknowledgement, no compassion, just the usual fortress response. But this wasn't a tabloid rumor. Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit in the United States, backed by testimony, photographs, and flight logs. Her legal team pushed forward with depositions and discovery. Prince Andrew, now distanced from public duties, faced the very real possibility of testifying under oath. For the monarchy, this wasn't just about Andrew anymore. It was about liability, reputation, legacy. Behind the scenes, lawyers negotiated feverishly to prevent a trial that would have dragged the royal family through a courtroom filled with uncomfortable truths. In early 2022, a settlement was reached. Andrew paid an undisclosed sum, reportedly in the millions, to resolve the lawsuit. He admitted no wrongdoing, But the language of the agreement was telling. It acknowledged Giuffre's suffering. It praised her bravery. It made clear that Epstein's victims deserved justice. In other words, the palace couldn't bury this one. The fact that Andrew settled, rather than fight the claims in court, was perceived by many as an implicit admission. His reputation, already fraying, was shredded. He was formally stripped of his remaining patronages and barred from using the title His Royal Highness in any official capacity. Even his mother, the famously unflappable Queen Elizabeth II, kept him at arm's length during her final years. For decades, the royals had operated on the principle that scandal could be managed, if not avoided. But the Andrew debacle showed that some reputational wounds couldn't be cauterized with titles and photo ops. And if the monarchy had spent years shielding Andrew from scrutiny, it had also spent years doing something else, quietly pressuring the press. Because long before this story broke, reporters were already being told to look away. 30. The palace pressured media not to report on Andrew for years. In the world of British tabloid journalism, few subjects are as simultaneously irresistible and untouchable as the royal family. Reporters have long known the rules. Certain stories are encouraged, others are quietly killed. And for years, one of the most untouchable topics was Prince Andrew's behavior, particularly his connection to Jeffrey Epstein. Rumors swirled in newsrooms as early as the mid-2000s. Editors had the photos. Journalists had the quotes. Former aides had begun whispering. But the stories kept dying on the vine, not because they lacked substance, but because they ran into the opaque wall of royal influence. Behind the scenes, palace officials were playing a strategic game, offering access in exchange for silence, hinting at future exclusives, and at times issuing thinly veiled threats about the consequences of publishing anything defamatory. Royal rota journalists, many of whom rely on continued access to the palace for their careers, knew better than to push too hard. The most infamous example came in 2015, when a Newsnight interview with one of Epstein's accusers was scrapped before it aired. Amy Robach, an American journalist, was caught on a hot mic lamenting how the story was pulled. "We had everything," she said. "It was unbelievable what we had. Clinton, we had everything." She named Andrew explicitly. The network allegedly feared losing access to the royals and potential legal consequences. BBC journalists have since confirmed that pressure was real. Palace aides contacted editors, advised caution, and reminded them of the public interest line between healthy curiosity and defamation. The goal wasn't always to erase stories, just delay them long enough to make them irrelevant. But that strategy collapsed when the legal case became impossible to ignore. Once lawsuits were filed and settlements reached, the press floodgates opened. What had once been whispers became headlines, and the palace found itself chasing a story it had spent years suppressing. The real scandal wasn't just what Andrew had done, it was how long it had been protected. And that pattern of concealment wasn't new. Because long before Andrew, another royal scandal had been sanitized for public consumption, its true stakes buried beneath the illusion of a love story. 31. The 1936 abdication was about more than love. For nearly a century, the official version of the 1936 abdication has remained one of the great romantic myths of the British monarchy. King Edward VIII gave up his throne for love. A man so devoted to Wallis Simpson, a twice-divorced American, that he would rather live in exile than reign without her. It's a convenient story. Clean. Tragic. And like most royal legends, only half true. At the time, the British government insisted the abdication was solely due to Wallis's unsuitability as queen. Divorce was taboo. The Church of England disapproved. Constitutional crisis. Case closed. But over the decades, historians and declassified files began to expose the real reasons behind Edward's forced exit. And they were far less romantic. Among them, Edward's political recklessness, his open disdain for the democratic system, and most damningly, his growing sympathies toward Nazi Germany. Even before the abdication, Edward had made high-ranking officials deeply uneasy. He meddled in policy. He made private comments suggesting admiration for Hitler's regime. He ignored diplomatic protocols. Wallace was a problem, but Edward was a liability. Documents released after World War II confirmed that British intelligence had been monitoring Edward's behavior long before he stepped down. There were letters between him and known fascist sympathizers, memorandums noting his desire for peace with Germany, even at the cost of appeasement. Officials feared that if Edward remained on the throne, he could push Britain toward an alliance with Hitler, or at the very least, destabilize the government from within. The abdication, then, was not just a love story, it was damage control. Wallace Simpson may have been the excuse, but Edward's political inclinations were the reason. The monarchy didn't exile him because he loved the wrong woman. They exiled him because he loved the wrong ideas. And once he was gone, the palace began its next cover-up, destroying anything that might suggest just how close their former king had come to imperiling the entire country. Starting with the most incriminating letters, those that were never meant to survive. 32. The royal household destroyed embarrassing letters and documents. Every institution has its version of a shredder. For the British royal family, it's not always mechanical. It's historical. And for decades, palace insiders whispered that damaging documents, personal letters, and incriminating files had a habit of disappearing just when public interest peaked. The monarchy didn't merely manage its image, it curated its memory. The rumor that the royal household systematically destroyed embarrassing materials wasn't just idle gossip, it was practically tradition. There were accounts of courtiers ordered to tidy up private archives. Biographers spoke of sudden access being revoked. Whole decades of correspondence, particularly involving controversial figures like Edward VIII, vanished with no explanation. Some called it discretion, others called it censorship. The turning point came when independent historians began noticing the gaps. Letters referenced in earlier works were suddenly missing in re-releases. Files at the Royal Archives in Windsor, though technically open to researchers, were restricted or labeled as under review for decades. One of the most glaring examples was the disappearance of letters between Edward VIII and members of the Nazi government. Letters that could have definitively linked the former king to fascist sympathies beyond rumor. Only fragments remain. Enough to raise eyebrows, but not enough for a full indictment. It wasn't just Edward. Private correspondence related to Queen Victoria, George V, even Prince Philip's early life has been suspiciously spotty. In 2003, it was revealed that entire boxes of letters had been withdrawn from the Royal Archives without explanation. They weren't relocated. They were simply gone. Defenders of the palace claimed it was a matter of privacy, protecting the dignity of the crown and the sensitivity of the material. But in practice, it served a different function, erasing the parts of history that didn't fit the brand. In the royal family, what isn't remembered officially might as well have never happened. But occasionally, even the best efforts at redaction fail. Because sometimes the truth isn't locked away in a vault. It's alive, institutionalized, and mislabeled as dead. And no amount of shredded paper could hide the shame of what the monarchy did to its own blood. 33. Queen Elizabeth II's cousins were falsely listed as dead. On paper, they had died young. Tragic, forgotten footnotes in the sprawling family tree of British royalty. According to Burke's Peerage, the official genealogical record of the aristocracy, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II, had passed away in the 1940s. Quietly, respectably, no questions asked. The reality? They were alive, institutionalized, and officially erased. Nerissa and Catherine were born with significant developmental disabilities, conditions the royal family, in the mid-20th century, viewed not as medical challenges, but as public embarrassments. In 1941, both women were placed in the Royal Earlswood Institution for Mental Defectives, a bleak facility outside London. There they would remain for the rest of their lives. For decades, they received no visits from their royal relatives, no birthday cards, no acknowledgement. They were alive, but invisible. The true scandal broke in 1987 when a Daily Express journalist discovered hospital records contradicting the official genealogy. Nerissa had only just died in 1986, not 1940. Catherine was still alive, well into her 60s. When confronted, the palace offered no meaningful explanation. A clerical error, they said, as if two human beings could be misfiled like a misplaced document. Care staff at the institution later revealed that neither woman could speak or care for themselves independently. Yet despite their vulnerability, their royal lineage was known and ignored. Nurses told stories of how they learned the women's identities only years later by piecing together fragments of old family gossip and medical files. The revelation sparked public outrage. How could a family that styled itself as the moral backbone of the nation simply write off its own? How could the same monarchy that waved from balconies and preached public duty allow its own cousins to be buried under bureaucracy? Catherine lived until 2014. Her life, like her sister's, was spent in silence, punctuated only by the cruelty of being forgotten on purpose. And while the royals erased those they couldn't accept, they also manufactured voices that were never theirs to begin with. Because even the Queen's words, it turns out, weren't always her own. 34. Palace officials ghost-wrote public letters from the Queen. There's a peculiar kind of comfort in believing that when the Queen writes, she means it. That when a carefully worded letter of condolence or a holiday message from the sovereign arrives, those phrases, warm, dignified, occasionally dry, are her own. But behind the gold-embossed stationery lies a far more scripted reality. For decades, rumors swirled that letters from the Queen were often drafted by royal aides, not Her Majesty herself. Officially, the palace maintained the illusion of personal authorship, one monarch reaching out to her people. But insiders quietly acknowledged what the signature concealed. Teams of staff members were routinely tasked with composing messages that would later bear the Queen's name. Eventually, former palace officials began speaking more openly. Speechwriters and secretaries revealed that much of the Queen's correspondence, particularly diplomatic letters, ceremonial acknowledgments, and responses to public inquiries, were ghostwritten by staff, sometimes with only minimal review from the monarch. Even holiday broadcasts, once believed to be the Queen's personal reflections, were often the result of weeks of collaborative drafting and editing. This wasn't illegal or even unusual in a royal context, but it was revealing. The monarchy, presented as a living symbol of personal continuity, was actually a machine. A brand managed by professionals who understood that authenticity could be manufactured just like everything else. The deception wasn't malicious. It was institutional. Letters of congratulations, sympathy, or gratitude were mass-produced with precision. Personal moments became bureaucratic procedures. The Queen didn't have to know the recipients. She didn't even have to read the letters. Her signature, applied with consistent grace, was more symbolic than expressive. Of course, the palace never advertised this process. The public wanted a queen who was caring, attentive, and ever watchful, not one whose words were fed through a committee of editors in smart suits with fountain pens. But while most ghost-written letters were harmless pageantry, some communications held real power. Because sometimes the royals weren't just sending messages, they were sending pressure. And the lines between commentary and interference got murkier than anyone was prepared to admit. 35. Royals interfered secretly in British politics. For a family that's constitutionally bound to stay out of politics, the British royals have long had an uncanny ability to influence it. Quietly, unofficially, and always behind several layers of plausible deniability. The idea that the monarchy meddled in legislation was long considered a Republican fever dream, until documents proved otherwise. For decades, rumors floated through political circles that senior royals, particularly Prince Charles, had a habit of making their views known to ministers, especially on issues touching on architecture, agriculture, and environmental policy. The palace denied any overreach, insisting all correspondence was non-political and respectful of constitutional limits. Then came the Black Spider memos. In 2015, after a decade-long legal battle under the Freedom of Information Act, a trove of letters written by Charles to various government departments was released. Nicknamed for his distinctively spidery handwriting, the memos revealed a prince with strong opinions and no hesitation in lobbying for them. He wrote to ministers about alternative medicine, countryside preservation, military equipment, and more. He urged action, questioned policy, and at times offered suggestions that bordered on directive. The tone was polite, but assertive, and the access? Unparalleled. While the Queen maintained an air of aloof constitutional neutrality, Charles was more direct. His defenders argued he was simply passionate. His critics called it inappropriate meddling. Whatever the motive, the fact remained. A senior royal was influencing public policy with private letters, none of which were subject to democratic oversight. The palace downplayed the impact, but government officials admitted the obvious. When a royal writes, you don't just ignore it. And if the public hadn't fought for those letters to be made public, they'd still be buried in filing cabinets labeled sensitive. This wasn't just one prince with a pen. It was a quiet breach of constitutional convention, proof that the monarchy's political silence is not as silent as advertised. And it wasn't the only convention the royals broke, because even names, the very symbols of royal identity, can be swapped out when the winds of war make the truth inconvenient. 36. Prince Charles lobbied for personal interests. For a man next in line to the throne, Prince Charles has always seemed oddly impatient with waiting. While the Queen mastered the art of inscrutability, Charles developed a habit of weighing in, especially when it came to matters that intersected with his own projects, charities, or personal passions. And for years, the palace dismissed reports that the prince was using his position to lobby for private interests. They called it dedication, advocacy, harmless involvement. Then the letters surfaced. Following the release of the infamous Black Spider memos, a broader pattern emerged, one where Charles didn't just nudge ministers on abstract issues like climate change or heritage buildings, but actively advocated for policies that aligned with his own ventures. In one letter, he pushed for more support of alternative medicine, something heavily promoted through his charity, the Foundation for Integrated Health. In another, he questioned plans to modernize military equipment, backing traditional designs over newer models, despite lacking relevant expertise. The tone was always polite, but the message was clear. The prince had views, and he expected them to be heard. Government departments, while not bound to comply, took these letters seriously. When royalty writes, civil servants listen. One of the most controversial episodes involved Charles's estate, the Duchy of Cornwall. Ostensibly a private entity, the duchy receives favorable treatment under UK law. Charles repeatedly intervened behind the scenes to maintain its special status, resisting reforms that would bring more transparency or taxation. While legally permissible, it revealed a deeper truth. The heir to the throne wasn't just lobbying for causes. He was lobbying for cash flow. After legal battles, more letters were released. The public began to understand that Charles's engagement with politics wasn't just about public service. Sometimes, it aligned a bit too neatly with his private interests. And yet, the story barely dented the monarchy's image. Charles weathered the criticism, and once crowned, his previous interventions were quietly rebranded as foresight. But long before Charles started writing letters, his ancestors had done something even more drastic to protect their legacy, by rewriting their own surname. 37. The royals changed their family name to hide their German roots. It was 1917 and Britain was at war. German bombs were falling on London. Anti-German sentiment was reaching a fever pitch, and the royal family, at the time bearing the very Germanic name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, suddenly realized they had a branding problem. The public had begun to notice. A German-sounding royal house during a war against Germany didn't exactly inspire loyalty. Crowds jeered. Editorial cartoons mocked the monarchy's Bavarian-sounding roots. The term enemy aliens was being thrown around recklessly, and it didn't help that German Zeppelins bombing British cities bore the same name as the royal family. So King George V did what any savvy institution would do under pressure. He rebranded. In July 1917, a royal proclamation officially changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to Windsor. It was crisp, English-sounding, and just nationalistic enough to survive the propaganda storm. The new name was inspired by Windsor Castle, a suitably British landmark with no umlauts in sight. The monarchy's German ancestry wasn't erased, it was simply renamed. Cousins across Europe, including the Kaiser himself, mocked the change in private. But the British press applauded the move, and the public accepted it as a patriotic gesture. Behind closed doors, however, the change was more than cosmetic. Royal titles and family affiliations were quietly dropped or anglicized. Letters from foreign relatives were destroyed or sealed. Even servants of German descent were dismissed from royal households. It was a purge, not just of names, but of associations. The irony? The British royal family remained deeply interwoven with German bloodlines. George V was the first cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm II. His wife, Queen Mary, had German ancestry. The entire royal tree had branches in every European court from Berlin to Vienna. But with a single proclamation, history was rewritten. Windsor became not just a surname, but a symbol of resilience, of nationalism, and of forgetting what was inconvenient. And just a few years later, the same family that renamed itself would help obscure another foreign influence, this time involving mystics, murder, and a Russian royal family clinging to collapse. 38. George V deliberately hid the truth about Rasputin's influence. To the British public, Rasputin was little more than a myth, an eerie bearded figure lurking in the collapsing Romanov court, whispered about in wartime newspapers, ridiculed in cartoons. But within royal circles, especially at Buckingham Palace, Rasputin was something else entirely, a problem, and one that King George V made a quiet decision to distance from, no matter what the truth was. The British and Russian royal families were not just political allies, they were blood relatives. George V and Tsar Nicholas II were first cousins, near identical in appearance, close in correspondence. And as Russia fell deeper into crisis in the 1910s, Britain was paying close attention. So when stories of Rasputin's influence over the Tsarina Alexandra exploded into the European press, concern rippled through royal and diplomatic channels alike. Rasputin's sway over the empress, whether spiritual, manipulative, or simply emotional, was viewed as a national security risk by British officials. Yet the monarchy downplayed his role. British government records from the time reveal a strategic silence. While British agents in Petrograd filed increasingly anxious reports about Rasputin's political influence, those reports were quietly buried. The palace publicly supported Nicholas, while privately withholding offers of refuge or asylum. Historians later discovered that George V had personally intervened to revoke an earlier British offer to shelter the Russian royal family after the revolution began. Officially, it was due to domestic instability in Britain. Unofficially, it was about optics. Hosting a fallen emperor whose family had been influenced by a controversial mystic would have made the British monarchy look fragile, too close to chaos for comfort. After the Romanovs were executed, the palace grieved in private but distanced itself in public. Letters and journals referencing Rasputin's presence at the Russian court were edited, removed, or destroyed. The story of the mad monk who helped bring down an empire was seen as toxic, and so the British monarchy did what it does best: quietly erased its proximity to danger. But while Rasputin was painted as an external threat, the British court had its own internal schemers. One queen in particular knew how to bend the press to her will, and she didn't need mystics. Just ink, influence, and a sharp memory for favors. 39. Queen Mary manipulated the press behind the scenes. Queen Mary is often remembered as a stoic, regal figure. Her pearl necklaces, her upright posture, her unwavering devotion to duty. But beneath the surface of her composed exterior was a political mind as sharp as any statesman's. And when it came to controlling her public image, Queen Mary was not just a subject of the press, she was a quiet editor of it. For years, rumors circulated that Queen Mary exercised influence over the British media, not by flashy decrees or public feuds, but through careful cultivation of relationships with editors, proprietors, and journalists. She understood something critical. The press, though ostensibly independent, was just another institution, and institutions could be managed. Recent releases of private correspondence and memoirs from journalists of the time confirm what many long suspected. Queen Mary wrote personally to newspaper owners expressing concern over photographs, headlines, and even phrasing. These weren't formal letters from the monarchy. They were behind-the-scenes nudges, polite on the surface, strategically terrifying underneath. She also knew when not to write. Journalists who stayed in her good graces, those who avoided scandalous speculation or provided glowing coverage, were granted favors, invitations, access. A quote here, a glimpse of a private royal event there, a quiet reward for compliance. Her manipulation wasn't limited to protecting herself. When scandals within the extended royal family threatened to erupt, extramarital affairs, social faux pas, ill-timed business dealings, Mary was often involved in efforts to reframe the story. In some cases, she even helped pre-approve official statements, suggesting edits before they were released to the public. What's striking is how successful she was. While continental monarchies crumbled in revolution and exile, the British monarchy survived, and Queen Mary's mastery of image control played no small role in that. The press never truly challenged her, because she understood a basic truth of power. If you can't kill the story, you can rewrite the ending. And while Mary played long games with ink and reputation, her descendants would face a far more modern scandal, the kind revealed not through rumor, but through offshore leaks and financial data. A spreadsheet doesn't lie, and neither do the numbers hidden in paradise. 40. Royal finances were far less transparent than publicly claimed. For centuries, the British monarchy has projected the image of frugality wrapped in grandeur, austerity in pearls, a value-for-money institution supported by taxpayers yet somehow floating above the drudgery of actual accounting. The palace has long assured the public that royal finances are transparent, modest, and strictly regulated. The reality? Far more opulent and far less open. For decades, critics questioned how the royals spent public money, particularly the sovereign grant and civil list payments that funded their operations. But every time a request for transparency surfaced, the palace responded with generalities and glossy reports, filled with ceremonial figures but light on itemized facts. The official line was always the same: royal spending is audited and responsible. Then came the leaks. In 2017, the Paradise Papers, a massive document leak detailing the offshore financial dealings of the global elite, confirmed what many suspected. Queen Elizabeth II's private estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, had invested millions in offshore tax havens. The duchy had stakes in funds registered in the Cayman Islands and Bermuda. One fund even invested in a rent-to-own company criticized for exploiting low-income Britons. The revelations struck a nerve. While the monarchy wasn't accused of breaking the law, the optics were damning. A royal estate investing offshore while citizens faced austerity? It shattered the illusion of detached nobility. The palace offered a brief, carefully worded statement distancing the Queen from the investment decisions, blaming advisors. But the damage was done. Further investigations revealed that the royals had access to secret clauses in financial agreements, exempting them from standard regulations. Multiple watchdog groups found that royal tax arrangements, land deals, and private investments were shielded from scrutiny under the vague justification of national interest. In short, the monarchy wasn't just opaque, it was designed to be. And while some scandals faded with the news cycle, others had a paper trail. Because as it turned out, even the more modest royals were occasionally hauled into court, not for diplomacy or protocol breaches, but for something far more mundane, a criminal conviction involving a very misbehaved dog. 41. Princess Anne had a secret criminal conviction. Of all the royals, Princess Anne has long styled herself as the no-nonsense one, the workhorse, the straight-talker in sensible tweed, less fuss, fewer tiaras. While her siblings and nephews made headlines for affairs and jet-setting, Anne quietly rode horses, opened hospitals, and dodged drama. That is, until 2002. The rumor was so absurd it almost sounded like satire. Princess Anne had been criminally charged because her English bull terrier attacked 2 children in Windsor Great Park. For a royal, it was unprecedented. A criminal conviction? In writing? With a fine? The palace, predictably, tried to downplay the event, but the courts did not. Anne became the first senior royal to be convicted of a criminal offense in modern British history. Under the Dangerous Dogs Act, she pleaded guilty. Her dog had escaped, attacked 2 children, and caused minor injuries. The court fined her $500 and issued an order for the dog to undergo behavior training. The press had a field day. The princess and the pup made tabloid front pages. But what truly unsettled royal watchers wasn't the incident itself. It was the breach in royal untouchability. Anne didn't claim immunity. She didn't send a lawyer. She appeared in court, pleaded guilty, paid the fine. Yet the conviction also raised uncomfortable questions. What if it had been a more serious injury? Would she still have been charged? Was the court being lenient because of her status, or harsh to make a point? The palace remained silent. Anne, in her typical fashion, offered no excuses. But privately, former staffers admitted that the royal household was rattled. Not by the offense, but by the precedent. A criminal conviction, however minor, meant the royal brand had a legal blemish. Not a rumor, not a headline, an official court record. Still, Anne weathered the storm, but her conviction hinted at a deeper truth. The monarchy's veil of exceptionality was thinner than it appeared, and that veil would be tested again, this time not by courts or dogs, but by decades of secret interventions in Parliament itself, where laws were reviewed, edited, and sometimes blocked, not by elected officials but by the royal family. 42. The royals used secret veto powers on UK legislation. For a family that supposedly holds only ceremonial power, the British monarchy has always had a peculiar habit of turning up where it isn't supposed to, inside the legislative process. Most citizens assume that when Parliament passes a law, it becomes law. That's the democracy they signed up for. But tucked behind velvet curtains and archaic tradition is a little-known mechanism known as Queen's Consent, and it gave the monarch and her heir the ability to quietly review and influence laws before anyone else ever saw them. For years, rumors circulated that this consent wasn't just ceremonial, that the Queen and Prince Charles were using it to interfere with legislation, especially when it affected their own interests. The palace insisted it was a formality, a rubber stamp, a vestige of the past with no real teeth. Then the documents came out. In 2021, after a protracted legal battle and investigative reporting from The Guardian, hundreds of government memos and internal emails were released under the Freedom of Information Act. They revealed that the Queen and Charles had reviewed more than 1,000 pieces of legislation over the decades, before they reached Parliament. This wasn't passive review. In several cases, changes were made at their request. The most egregious examples involved laws that affected royal property, tax liabilities, or hereditary privileges. In one case, the Queen's lawyers lobbied to exempt her private estates from transparency regulations meant to expose the ownership of land and companies. The law was quietly amended. In another, Charles intervened in a bill affecting tenant rights on Duchy of Cornwall land, because he was the landlord. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were strategic edits, often targeting clauses that could damage royal finances or privacy. And the public never knew. The palace's response? Minimal. They insisted it was legal, constitutional, and long-standing practice. But the fact remained. Unelected royals were quietly shaping the laws of a modern democracy from behind a constitutional loophole. Of course, legislation isn't the only thing the royals tried to control. They also had an opinion on how they were covered. And sometimes that meant applying pressure in a place even more powerful than Parliament, the press room. 43. Palace. PR pressured journalists into flattering coverage. It's often said that the British monarchy survives not just on tradition, but on narrative, the story it tells and the story we're allowed to hear. Behind the dazzling pageantry and balcony waves lies a sophisticated public relations operation, finely tuned over decades. And at the heart of that operation is a simple strategy: reward loyalty, punish intrusion. For years, royal watchers noticed the pattern. Journalists who published positive, respectful pieces were granted access, press invites, interview opportunities, curated photo ops. Those who didn't toe the line? Frozen out. No comment, no access. Or worse, formal complaints to their editors. Rumors of these tactics were often brushed off as the price of covering powerful people. But former royal correspondents began to speak out. Several revealed that they had received calls from palace press officers, suggesting edits or demanding retractions for stories that weren't even factually wrong, just inconvenient. In one documented case, the BBC was pressured to alter a documentary about Prince Charles's relationship with the press. Producers reported being leaned on heavily, warned that future collaboration could be complicated if certain footage remained in the final cut. Tabloid editors also confirmed that palace aides had tried to suppress stories by offering exclusives elsewhere or flagging future friendly content opportunities. The soft censorship was never explicit, but it didn't have to be. The message was clear. Cover the royals the way they want to be seen, or risk losing the privilege of access entirely. Even off-the-record briefings were weaponized. Leaks about problematic royals, Diana in the 90s, Meghan in the 2010s, often came from unnamed palace sources, providing convenient headlines while keeping the crown's hands clean. It wasn't just damage control, it was narrative engineering. The monarchy, after all, doesn't just want to survive, it wants to be beloved. And if shaping public perception requires shaping the press, then shaping the press it will. But sometimes, even the most polished PR operation can't contain what slips out from behind the palace gates, especially when it comes from someone destined to wear the crown, who also has a habit of throwing furniture. 44. Prince William's temper issues. Prince William is often marketed as the monarchy's safe pair of hands, the responsible heir, the modern royal, the contrast to his more unpredictable brother. His public image is calm, measured, and just cheeky enough to pass for relatable. But behind closed doors, another version of William has been whispered about for years. One that's less polished, more volatile, and decidedly less patient with the world around him. Rumors of William's temper began surfacing during his university years. At the time, the press chalked it up to youthful stress. But those rumors persisted into adulthood, surfacing through off-the-record comments from staff, journalists, and eventually, Harry himself. In his 2023 memoir, Spare, Prince Harry offered the most direct account yet. He described his older brother as hot-headed, quick to anger, and prone to outbursts during private confrontations. In one chapter, Harry even recounted a physical altercation. William allegedly grabbed him during a heated argument and knocked him to the floor. While the palace offered no comment, the claim was neither confirmed nor denied, and the incident instantly reignited speculation about William's temperament. Other former aides have alluded to difficult moments behind the scenes. Some described an intense management style. Others spoke of short fuses during press negotiations or scheduling disputes. The common thread? That William demands absolute loyalty and rarely tolerates dissent. To the public, these accounts seem at odds with the image of the dutiful future king. But inside the royal bubble, anger is often seen not as a flaw, but as control. A way to assert dominance in a system where everyone is smiling, but few are honest. And perhaps the most telling sign is that no one inside the palace has publicly pushed back on the narrative. Because to acknowledge it is to admit that beneath the royal polish, even the most future-ready heir might still be shaped by the same fragile power games as the rest of his family. That fragility became all the more visible when a new figure entered the fold, an outsider, an actress, and eventually a duchess. One who would be praised, ridiculed, and then slowly dismantled in real time. 45. The royal family treated Meghan Markle unfairly. When Meghan Markle joined the royal family in 2018, it was supposed to signal a new era, a more diverse, modern, and accessible monarchy. Her wedding to Prince Harry drew a global audience. Her presence brought optimism, symbolism, and media attention the monarchy hadn't seen since Diana. But beneath the surface of smiling photo ops and glowing headlines, something darker was already underway. The rumors began early, that aides disliked her attitude, that staff quit in frustration, that she was difficult, ambitious, not understanding the hierarchy. The palace said little. British tabloids said everything. Anonymous sources leaked petty details. An argument about a tiara, a supposed feud over flower girls, breach of protocol, this, diva demands, that. But behind the headlines, something more insidious was happening. Multiple journalists and former palace staff later confirmed that Meghan was treated differently from day one. Requests from her team were dismissed or delayed. Guidance was inconsistent. One senior aide reportedly said she didn't know her place. Royal press offices often failed to correct misleading stories about her, even as they rushed to protect more senior royals from less serious coverage. Then came the Oprah interview. For the first time, Meghan and Harry spoke publicly about their experience. Meghan described how, behind the smiling public facade, she felt isolated, unsupported, and actively targeted by both the press and those within the royal institution. She revealed how false stories were allowed to flourish and how her mental health deteriorated under the pressure. Harry confirmed that members of his family had conversations about the potential skin tone of their future child, an admission that sent shockwaves through the monarchy's reputation. The palace responded with its signature understatement, "Recollections may vary." But the damage was done. The facade had cracked. And the idea that the royal family was a welcoming modern institution suddenly felt like an old PR story desperately trying to survive in a world that no longer believed it. Yet the most damning revelations weren't just about who stayed silent, but about who made it impossible for Harry and Meghan to stay at all. 46. Harry and Meghan were pushed out rather than chose to leave. The public version of events was simple enough. Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties. They wanted privacy, we were told. A quieter life, fewer flashbulbs, a nice house in Canada, then California. That was the narrative the palace leaned into. Calm, amicable, vaguely regretful. But that version evaporated under scrutiny, and what emerged instead was a slow, methodical campaign, not to support the couple, but to push them out. From the beginning, Harry and Meghan's role in the family was unstable. They were working royals, but not senior enough to warrant full independence. Popular enough to draw headlines, but too unpredictable to trust. Internal aides referred to them as the Sussex problem. Public goodwill, especially after their wedding and tours, was at an all-time high. Yet instead of building on that momentum, the palace tightened control. Meghan's team requests were reportedly denied or delayed. Decisions about press, travel, even wardrobe were second-guessed by higher-ranking aides. When they asked for a hybrid model of royal service, splitting time between North America and the UK, they were rebuffed. There was no middle ground, all in or all out. The tone behind the scenes grew colder. Private conversations became veiled warnings. Leaks to the press increased. Stories that portrayed Meghan as demanding, Harry as fragile. When the couple pushed back, they were painted as disloyal. By the time they announced their departure in early 2020, the palace's response was icy. Titles stripped, patronages revoked, security removed. This wasn't a couple abandoning the royal family. It was a couple cornered into leaving. Their later interviews and Harry's memoir Spare detailed the pressure in agonizing clarity, institutional silence, emotional neglect, and a royal machinery more interested in preserving hierarchy than protecting its own. And as Harry tried to protect his wife from the same forces that had consumed his mother, another disturbing echo from Diana's past returned, one that revealed just how long she had been fighting to be heard in the first place. Because decades earlier, her phone wasn't just buzzing with press calls, it was being tapped. 47. Princess Diana's phone was tapped. By the late 1980s, Princess Diana's relationship with the press had shifted from fascination to obsession. She couldn't move without being followed. She couldn't call a friend without a headline the next day. At first, it seemed like tabloid persistence. But then came the rumors. Theories that her private conversations weren't just overheard, they were intercepted. At the time, the idea that Diana's phone was being tapped was treated like conspiracy. Too dramatic, too suspicious. Yet Diana believed it, and said so. She told friends she could hear strange clicks on the line. She avoided using the palace phones. She started writing more letters by hand. Publicly, the palace dismissed her fears. So did government officials. She was paranoid, they said, imagining things. The press framed her concerns as symptoms of emotional instability. Years later, she was proven right. In the early 2000s, during the News of the World phone hacking scandal, it was revealed that reporters and private investigators had been illegally intercepting voicemails of celebrities, politicians, and yes, royals. Diana's name came up repeatedly. In one case, a former employee of the newspaper admitted they had access to conversations between Diana and close friends, even days before they appeared in the press. It wasn't just the tabloids. Diana suspected she was being monitored by the intelligence services. MI5 denied any involvement, of course, but former security personnel later hinted that her communications were likely under unofficial observation, especially during the final years of her life, when her international activism and complicated relationships made her both admired and threatening to various interests. In hindsight, Diana's fears weren't delusions. They were informed. She lived under surveillance, both unofficial and unacknowledged. Her voice was a threat because it was honest, emotional, and unscripted. And perhaps most chillingly, she seemed to know that the tap wasn't just on her phone, it was on her fate. And in one private note, handwritten and chillingly prescient, she left behind a warning that still hangs over the monarchy like a storm that never left. 48. Diana predicted her own death under suspicious circumstances. In the last years of her life, Princess Diana became increasingly vocal about her fears. She no longer trusted her surroundings, her phones, her protection officers, or even the brakes on her car. At the time, much of the public and press rolled their eyes. Her anxiety was treated as melodrama. Her warnings dismissed as paranoia. The idea that someone might want her gone was simply too explosive to entertain. And yet, she wrote it down. In 1995, Diana handwrote a note, later referred to as the Mishkan Note, in which she claimed that someone inside the royal system was planning an accident in my car, brake failure, and serious head injury, as a means of clearing the path for Charles to remarry. The note was given to her lawyer, Lord Mishkan, who kept it on file. After Diana's death in 1997, it gained new relevance, though it was initially suppressed by Scotland Yard and only disclosed during later investigations. It's hard to overstate the eeriness of the prediction. Diana died just 2 years later in a car crash in Paris, under circumstances that remain murky despite numerous inquiries. No functioning seatbelt, a high-speed chase, missing CCTV footage. A drunk driver, yes, but also a story that never sat quite right with those closest to her. The official inquest ruled it an unlawful killing due to gross negligence by the driver and the pursuing paparazzi. But even that finding didn't close the book. Public suspicion lingered. Was it really an accident? Or the realization of something she had seen coming in her rearview mirror long before the final turn? The monarchy, of course, offered silence. No response to the note, no interest in the deeper implications. The institution had lost its most unpredictable member, its most human face. And the message was clear: don't ask questions. But some questions didn't need answers to be damaging. Because even long after Diana was gone, the machine that had tried to erase her image turned its focus towards someone else, her son. And in doing so, it weaponized a cruel rumor that refused to die. 49. Prince Harry's paternity rumors were used as smear campaigns. From the moment Prince Harry stepped into the public eye, the whispers began. Red hair, a cheeky grin, a fondness for rebellion. People, particularly the tabloids, couldn't resist pointing out the physical differences between Harry and his father, Charles. And into that speculative space stepped a name: James Hewitt. Hewitt, a former cavalry officer, had a well-known affair with Princess Diana during the late 1980s. Years later, as Harry grew into adulthood, comparisons between the two circulated online, in gossip columns, and, at times, in less than subtle headlines. The suggestion? That Hewitt, not Charles, was Harry's biological father. It was a cruel and persistent rumor, one Diana had already preemptively addressed. In interviews and correspondence, she made it clear. Her relationship with Hewitt began after Harry was born. There was no overlap, no question. And yet the rumor endured, not as fact, but as a weapon. What turned this from nasty gossip into scandalous truth wasn't the paternity itself. It was that palace aides and insiders reportedly helped spread it. According to both Harry's memoir Spare and interviews with royal correspondents, elements within the institution used the rumor as a way to undercut Harry's legitimacy, especially as his relationship with Meghan Markle strained the family's image. The suggestion wasn't just that Harry was difficult, it was that he might not really be royal. It was character assassination by innuendo, the kind that never needs proof because the damage is already done. It allowed the institution to subtly distance itself while still claiming innocence. Just rumors, they could say, rumors they'd helped cultivate. Harry, in Spare, addressed the pain these whispers caused, not because he doubted who he was, but because the people who should have protected him didn't bother to stop them. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because another royal, his mother, was also manipulated into trusting people she shouldn't have. And what started with deceit ended with one of the most infamous interviews in royal history, born from betrayal and edited behind the Queen's back. 50. Palace aides manipulated Diana's BBC interview. By 1995, Princess Diana was no longer just a royal. She was a global phenomenon, a public figure navigating the ruins of her marriage with terrifying clarity. She had become the story, and she wanted to tell it herself. That opportunity came in the form of a clandestine interview with the BBC's Panorama, conducted by journalist Martin Bashir. What the world saw was raw, unprecedented, and unforgettable. 3 of us in this marriage, she said, and with that, the myth of royal stability shattered in real time. But what the world didn't see, what took over 25 years to emerge, was how Bashir had secured the interview. In 2021, a formal investigation revealed that Bashir had used falsified bank documents and manipulated claims to stoke Diana's paranoia. He showed her fake statements suggesting her closest aides were being paid to spy on her. He played into her existing fears of surveillance, betrayal, and palace plotting. The deception worked. Diana agreed to the interview under the impression that she was being watched and undermined from within. In reality, she was being misled by the very journalist who claimed to give her a voice. Lord Dyson's report on the incident was damning, not just for Bashir, but for the BBC itself, which had covered up the misconduct for decades. Senior executives were found to have failed in their duty of transparency, protecting the institution over the individual. The palace's response was careful, if not calculated. Prince William issued a rare public statement, condemning the interview and blaming it for worsening his mother's distress. Prince Harry went further, linking the media's manipulation to the chain of events that ultimately led to Diana's death. The tragic irony? The interview that had once seemed like Diana's most powerful act of defiance turned out to be a trap. And even in that betrayal, the theme remained the same: information weaponized, trust broken, reputation rearranged, just like the secret efforts the royals took to preserve one of their most precious assets, not their legacy, but their wealth. 51. The royals lobbied to hide their private wealth. The British royal family is often portrayed as a symbol of national heritage, antique jewels, ceremonial duties, and just enough public funding to keep the curtains clean. The official line is one of modesty, a dutiful monarchy that lives well, but not extravagantly, thanks to public oversight and inherited land. But behind this image is an empire of wealth, and for decades the royals worked diligently to keep that empire hidden. Documents uncovered through journalistic investigations, including leaks from government archives and internal treasury memos, revealed that Queen Elizabeth II personally lobbied ministers to alter transparency laws in the 1970s. The target? Legislation that would have made her private investments publicly known. The proposed law aimed to reveal the shareholdings of wealthy individuals, including those connected to the monarchy. But legal advisors acting on behalf of the Queen pressed for a carve-out, one that would shield her personal holdings from disclosure. The lobbying succeeded. The government quietly inserted a clause that allowed royal investments to be funneled through a shell corporation, effectively blocking the public from seeing where and how the monarch's private wealth was managed. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It protected hundreds of millions in assets held by the Queen and the Duchy of Lancaster. Unlike the sovereign grant, publicly funded and somewhat transparent, this was wealth entirely shielded by law and custom. The palace defended the move as necessary for security, arguing that publicizing royal investments could invite risk. But critics saw it differently. A taxpayer-supported institution using its influence to dodge scrutiny while the rest of the country endured financial austerity. What's more, the lobbying was never publicly disclosed at the time. The very process of exemption was itself exempt from visibility. And just like that, the modern monarchy's wealth became not just untouchable, but nearly invisible. But even behind the palace walls, invisibility has limits, especially when that same hidden wealth was being used, not to maintain statecraft or charity, but to quietly fund personal indulgences, luxury expenses, and royal shopping sprees billed to the British public. 52. Royal allowances were spent on personal luxuries. The British monarchy has long defended its taxpayer funding with the same refrain, that it provides value, dignity, and stability in return for public support. The sovereign grant, the duchies, the crown estate, they all form a complex web designed to maintain the institution's pageantry without allegedly veering into indulgence. But behind the scenes, another reality took shape. Royal allowances, those discrete sums allocated for official duties and maintenance of working royals have often been redirected to fund a lifestyle far more lavish than the public was ever meant to see. For years, whispers surrounded questionable spending, renovations of private apartments, designer wardrobes, chartered flights for leisure, even £50,000 bathroom upgrades funded through murky channels. But it wasn't until internal audits were leaked and independent investigations surfaced that the extent of the royal expense culture became undeniably clear. Documents revealed that millions in public funds were quietly spent on personal luxuries. Prince Andrew, for instance, used royal grants to refurbish a private residence, complete with custom fittings and extravagant furnishings, far beyond the scope of what official use would require. Other expenditures included first-class travel to private events, staff salaries for personal household employees, and high-end interior design consultations, all billed indirectly to taxpayers. The justification was always the same. These expenses were tied to the royals' public duties. But attempts to obtain detailed breakdowns through Freedom of Information requests were often stonewalled. The palace argued for exceptional privacy. Critics argued it was systemic obfuscation. In the background, royal accountants walked a fine line, categorizing expenses creatively, absorbing private indulgences into public roles, and ensuring that the public narrative remained one of restraint. Meanwhile, the actual line between duty and luxury blurred into irrelevance. But eventually some of the numbers came out, and they painted a picture not of national service, but of an elite institution shielding its indulgences behind tradition and secrecy. Still, the greatest financial sleight of hand wasn't in bathrooms or flights. It was in legislation itself. Because in Scotland, a royal intervention quietly rewrote the rules to protect the Queen's private wealth, and for once they left a paper trail behind. 53. Queen Elizabeth II intervened in Scottish law to protect her assets. By most public accounts, Queen Elizabeth II was above the political fray. She reigned but did not rule. She observed but did not interfere. At least that's what we were told. But in 2021, an investigation revealed that the Queen had personally intervened in a draft law being debated in the Scottish Parliament, one that, if passed in its original form, could have exposed her private land holdings to greater environmental regulation and scrutiny. The bill in question was designed to make it easier for local governments to compel landowners to improve environmental practices and reduce carbon emissions. But when it came across the Queen's desk, via a procedure known as Queen's Consent, her legal team stepped in. What they asked for wasn't a clarification or ceremonial approval. They requested an exemption, and they got it. Scottish lawmakers quietly amended the legislation, inserting a clause that ensured the Queen's private land, specifically the vast Balmoral estate, would not be subject to the same rules as everyone else. Other landowners would be bound by the new environmental obligations. The monarch would not. The revelation sparked outcry, not because it was illegal. It wasn't. But because it shattered the illusion of a monarch above personal interest. The palace issued no apology, only a tepid statement that legal reviews were standard procedure. But nothing about the result was standard. It was a monarch protecting her portfolio from public accountability, using a mechanism most citizens didn't even know existed. This wasn't a one-off. The Guardian's reporting highlighted more than 60 instances where Queen's consent had been used in Scotland alone, often in relation to laws that could affect royal property or finances. The monarchy, which has spent decades cultivating an image of national unity and selfless service, had quietly carved out protections for itself at the legislative level. And just like that, a crown meant to symbolize equality under the law was revealed to be its exception. Because even in the 21st century, royal privilege doesn't die. It evolves. Faster than legislation, deeper than tradition, and quieter than the truth.